All right, welcome everybody. Good morning. I'm allergic to podiums, so I can't kind of stand here like that. So my name is John Vecchi. I'm Chief Marketing Officer of Phosphorus, and we're going to talk about kind of what you see there on the title. So we're going to dive into what is IOT, why the hell do we call it that? We're going to talk about a host of things that we've discovered after about 5 years of kind of interrogating and working with large enterprises, government agencies, public, private, all over the place, hundreds of them as we've looked at a lot of these devices. We're going to talk about some of the threats. We're going to talk about the state of these things. And then at the end, we'll kind of talk about what do you do about it? So let's kind of dive in. A little bit about me. You're probably wondering, why is a CMO here talking about this? I've been about 25 years in this industry. Most of that time on the technology, strategy, product side. I've been on the front end of some of the biggest markets in this space with some of the companies you see there, things like markets like IDS, IPS, DLP, vulnerability management, next generation firewall, security intelligence, big data, cloud security. And so I'm a technologist at heart. Spent some time on the VC side, which is always very interesting. Have my own podcast you can find on all the platforms around cloud security. And excited to say I'm launching a brand new podcast this month, which will be on Spotify, Google, all of those talking about IoT. So look forward to that. All right, let's talk about this. Why the hell do we call it XIoT? What is it? The reason I call it XIoT is because there's a hell of a lot of these devices, and a lot of them sometimes aren't even considered, or we don't think about them as IoT. And they span a lot of different areas. So again, you're going to hear me talk about devices that are kind of classic enterprise IoT. You're going to hear me talk about devices that are kind of ICS, PLCs, kind of the OT side, as you can see here, as well as a lot of network connected devices that you oftentimes don't think are IoT. Things like load balancers, routers, access points, these kinds of things. But there's many things that are very common across these devices, right? They all are kind of purpose-built. They've got purpose-built firmware, right? Most of the firmware is Linux-based. It can be Android, it can be BSD, it can be real-time operating systems like VxWorks, BusyBox, a lot of those things. But these basically are computers. They don't have a keyboard. They speak TCP/IP, and you can't put agents on these things. So you can't throw Tanium and CrowdStrike and just put it on there. So you can't do that. So that's kind of common denominator of what all these things are and why kind of it's very difficult to see them, protect them, get visibility, and do all the things we kind of need to do with traditional endpoints and computers. And there's many of them, right? So we're in this business. Our job is to kind of keep track of these devices. This is a study done by Business Insider, which they do a pretty thorough job. And you can just see, we always say there's, north of 50 billion at least of these things, and it aligns pretty much with this. You can just see over the course of time, the growth of these devices. It's almost just mind-boggling how many of them are and the growth and all the different applications that you can see all the way up through. You get to 2020 and they're already saying there's 50 billion. So basically, right now, there's probably close to 70 billion of these things out there connected, right? Almost every minute, there's hundreds of new ones connecting to the internet every day. So there's a lot of these, and it's huge, and it represents, as one of the things I'll talk about is the amount of the attack surface this stuff represents, right? But one of the things I like to do is look at this stuff almost from the animal kingdom, and this is kind of the way we look at them as far as identifying them and securing them, right? And think about it. I love looking at different markets. I've been on the front of these kinds of markets, right? So just think about comparing the number of these to something like cloud security, right? And if you go look, you can look at Amazon and Google's and everyone's filings, and they literally will tell you how many servers they have. Not virtual machines, but servers. So when you look at the whole cloud security market, this is about 10 million servers that comprise that market. It's not that many servers, right? And you look at the endpoint market, right? I consider that, if the security industry is a three-legged stool of major areas, that's one of them, endpoint, right? There's about 5 billion endpoints out there. It's a little bit less, but getting close to the number of people on the planet, right? So about 5 billion. Interesting thing about that is, number of endpoints every year, are they going up or down? Up. They're going down. Every year they're decreasing the numbers. Think about that. There's just fewer of them. It is not a growing market. It is actually decreasing every year, right? So that number will go down as time goes up. Then you look at this. 50 billion is about the number of all the birds on the planet, right? Interesting thing about this is it's growing at 18 to 20% every year, right? So it's growing very big. And, you know, again, Miko's got a great book out called If It's Smart, It's Vulnerable. And great book if you want to read it. But he just talks about the breadth of these applications and how it's going to be the future of everything that's connected. And so, you know, it's something that's really interesting to think about, right? So I don't know if you guys know Shodan. It's kind of an interesting search engine. You go up there and search for things. It's not that this is highly experimental or anything. It's, you know, but it's kind of for fun. But just went up and kind of did a search for a few things. These are kind of public-facing connected devices that Shodan can find, right? But it's kind of interesting to just go plug it in and see. Cameras, nearly 5 million of them pop up, right? VoIP phones, right? 250,000, 83,000 printers, just right off the bat. Almost 14,000 UPS devices, okay? Uninterruptible power supplies. Why on earth there's almost 14,000 UPSs connected to the open internet is beyond me. But there you go, right? A little interesting thing about UPSs, 100% of them, literally 100% of them deployed are using default credentials. There is not one. In fact, in our company, we have a little game. We say, anyone in the company, any researcher, any SE, anyone, can find a UPS that isn't deployed with default credentials. By the way, when I mention default credentials, I'm not telling you anything you can't go up on Google and find. Default credential of every single one of these devices, which is primarily an APC device, is APC, lowercase. It's really difficult to crack into that, right? So we have a thing that if anyone can find one of these that doesn't have APC, they get a free steak dinner for you and all your friends. They've been eating a lot of Chick-fil-A because there aren't any of them, right? So this is just interesting, and we'll talk about some of that. Okay, so let's talk about some of the, what I call stories from the trenches, and we'll just go through some of these attacks. They're very interesting. So Fronton, how many of you have heard of Fronton? So Fronton is a serious piece of enterprise software. I mean, when I look at the platform we built, and this is as sophisticated as some of the software all of you guys have, build, deploy. This is a serious piece of software. It was designed by the Russians to hack any ex-IoT device on the planet, right? So the Russian FSB built this thing. It is a military-grade nation-state piece of software, right? And then what happened is the Digital Revolution group said, we're going to go hack the FSB. And they went and hacked the FSB and then took Fronton and put it on BitTorrent and every other torrent you want to find, right? So now what you have is out there in the wild for most anybody to go find on their favorite torrent is a serious piece of military-grade ex-IoT malware that's designed primarily to spy, push out malware, drive different types of attacks, botnets, whatever it might be. Anything they wanted to do with these devices, this is what this is designed. There's even an area of this software that connects to social network to push out disinformation. That's how sophisticated this thing is. And it's out there. And it's just available and probably being used. And one of those tools that we definitely want to keep an eye on, but that is a serious piece of software. All right, you've heard a lot about this, right? So HR 5515 started, addressing this. In fact, just the past couple days this week in the news, you might have heard of a story about Huawei and some of the spies that are trying to deal with this. So, China's done, they're incredible. They just flat out eliminated the middleman. They just said, why mess around with trying to get malware on the thing and hack it? We just ship it with malware. These things are just shipped and packaged, ready to go. And you can see some of your favorite ones in here. And specifically, a lot of the Chinese devices, we focus a lot on cameras. You think about cameras, and I'll talk a lot about them. They got power over Ethernet. They got Bluetooth Wi-Fi. They've got Telnet. They ship with undocumented Telnet, the SSH. It's all open, right? So, what could go wrong? And so, a lot of these things are basically shipped with malware. For example, I think it was from 2018 to 2020, there was a camera on Amazon. It was designated Amazon favorite, or the thing where Amazon says it's their top rated one. It was the Wise camera for 2 years. The thing about cameras is it kind of overlaps consumer enterprise. These devices are very kind of consumer, so a lot of times you'll get, think of a big law firm or something, right? Or a financial institution. They have so many cameras. Some of these guys have so many cameras. They're deploying all kinds of them. They're probably the same ones you might have in your home or a pizza shop or something. So they really do cross enterprise and consumer. So this thing was 2 years on Amazon as Amazon Choice. It's shipped with incredible malware. And that was so nice of them because when you plugged it into your network, it basically had Nmap that just did a full, just for you, it did a full scan of your network, all ports and the whole thing, right? And just funneled that thing back to the command center, right? If you did anything with the controls, I'm just gonna turn off audio, I'm gonna turn off video, gave you that nice red light that said it's off, and it was on. And so it was very sophisticated. Just terabytes and terabytes of data shipping back to China, right, on these devices. And it just shipped with it and just right there when you plugged it in. So we're going to talk a lot about cameras because you're going to hear that common denominator. And of course, you might have heard of this one. So Hikvision is another huge, these things are everywhere. And the big headline was over 80,000 exploitable Hikvision cameras, and multiply that by about 10, right? Exposed online. They're everywhere. They're shipped with malware, loaded with vulnerabilities. No one's looking at these things. And so, 2,300 organizations across 100 countries. And it says, they haven't applied the security firmware that was available in September 2021. Well, that's not a surprise. Most of the firmware on these devices is at least 7 years old, right? So no one they don't even touch the passwords, let alone the firmware. So, actually they were doing pretty good that they allowed this patch in 2021. No one's gonna do anything with it. There's too many of them, right? So that's an interesting one. Okay, so let's talk about Mirai. This was around 2016. It involved the access cameras. So basically, you took a cable modem, a couple routers, an access camera, and low-level skill set, and you just said, let's go after these access cameras. Great. So access is interesting. There's about 750 models of these, right? doesn't really matter. They're all deployed with pretty much the same default password. If it isn't using the default password, there's about 8 on any given day. And of course, as we've looked at these, if there isn't a default password used, and usually it's when the device is first deployed, there might be a different password, but it's incredibly predictable and everyone knows what it is, right? So even if it isn't default, there's about 6, 7 to 8 of these where you just know I'm going to try each one and I got you, right? And so they basically leverage Telnet port 23. This is, common thing. A lot of this is undocumented, just out of the box, clear text, open, just like easy, right? And so they went and hit these things with a DDoS attack. And the interesting thing about this, I don't get terribly excited about botnets, right? I mean, it's not like a Melissa virus or a slammer worm or something, which is probably coming on these devices. But the interesting thing about this is just to show, the focus on these devices, right? You don't need to be an experienced hacker to go do this. It's wide open, it's super easy. I mean, does not require a lot of effort. And you can go deploy botnets on these things like crazy, right? And it just really demonstrated the focus of this stuff. But in the meantime, it took down some pretty big networks, right? So from that perspective, I mean, you can do some damage. If they're focused on botnets, it's really kind of an enterprise and it's a business. They're not really in it to do a lot of harm specifically, although at the same time they can. But it's the point of the focus of this, right? They see these devices, that's the next plane of attack for botnets. They're just so wide open. These things are just mini computers. When I see a camera, I see a Linux server that happens to be a camera. And so do the hackers, and so do the nation states, right? They see these things as a bunch of Linux servers out there, man, wide open. Like, why wouldn't we go after them, right? So now you move to quiet exit. So Mandiant found this one. This is very recent. So, we all get that you can exploit an XIOT device with a 10-year-old critical CBS, right? We get that, right? This thing was built to compromise these devices for exfil. This was the first time. So there's 2 very interesting things about quiet exit. It's focused on exfil, and it's basically designed to use traditional means of exploit. So they're going to come in through a phishing attack or just basic common methods and TTPs of going and compromising an IT asset. They're going to do that first. And then once they're in, they're pivoting to these devices. So they're going to come in and then they're going to go pivot to your cameras, your printers, your VoIP phones, some network devices, load balancers, wireless access points, and things like that. The reason they're going to go pivot to those is because no one's watching them, right? So I can go pivot to those things and I can just siphon data off of that thing, right? So again, they basically use kind of this drop bear SSH reverse tunnel. It's not terribly sophisticated. It's fairly straightforward, relatively common. It's not anything major, but they just compromise these things. They do an SSH reverse tunnel, and they just do API calls. What they did on this thing was they did API calls to all the on-premise, and they went into the cloud, and they just siphoned stuff from, the executive team, from the M&A team, from the product team, from all of that, right? And this particular attack, they had an 18-month dwell time. Very, very common. Again, Russian kind of intelligence linked to this thing for exfil, right? Interesting thing here is you can just see I'm a nation state, right? And I'm looking now how I am going to go attack these assets. And I'm shifting big time to XIOT because these things are very powerful. They're just loaded with vulnerabilities. They're all connected, right? And no one's looking at these things. No one's looking at them. And quiet exit is very prominent. This is very sophisticated. Next to Fronton, it's the most sophisticated piece of malware we've ever seen for XIOT. And it's out there, and it's probably all over the place, and no one knows it. But Mandiant found it. Very, 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 very interesting attack. We see it all the time when we go into enterprises. So RSOCs, here, this one's interesting. Why do I want to talk about this? This is a botnet, and again, this was kind of a takedown. So this is a success story, right? There's botnets all over the place, and you know botnets, it's like a Christmas tree, right? You just pull one thing off and it pops back up, and I mean, it's very difficult to deal with these things, but law enforcement internationally does take a lot of effort to take down botnets. Now, this was one that was very prominent. And so you had Netherlands, Germany, UK, US all came together to try to take down this thing. And they actually did take it down. It's probably popped back up again. But what was interesting about this was that this botnet was attacking OT assets, okay? So ICS systems, right? PLCs and all that kind of stuff. It's very focused on that. There were some network devices and a few cameras and some of the enterprise IoT, but the bulk of this was focused on PLCs and all of the stuff in ICSs and SCADA environments and all of that. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the OT side in these devices because they're definitely being focused on, right? And that's what was really interesting about this, is that the focus on those. You wouldn't think about that. And even in quiet exit, you saw them go to PLCs with that, right? And this thing was crazy. This was very sophisticated. They leased this out for $30 a day. But if you paid $100, you can get very sophisticated 24/7 tech support for your botnet. And they leased this system out, right? And you just see the kind of span of devices. But if anyone thinks that kind of the OT side isn't included in all of this, you're terribly mistaken, because we see that as one of the big attack vectors that's happening. So let's talk about PLCs. PLC is interesting. A couple things. You can't really talk to these things with traditional tools, right? You can't just throw a vulnerability scanner up and say, let's go scan all my OT stuff, right? I call that waterboarding. That's what it's like to that device, right? It's like, here, let me talk to you, and I'm going to waterboard you while I try to get some information from you. It doesn't work, right? So we need to rethink that. These devices are also very old, right? An expected lifespan of a PLC device is over 30 years. Sometimes it's 40 years. These things are decades old in many cases. Are there newer modern ones? Oh, hell yeah. But a lot of these devices are very, very old, right? And that age thing has, is a factor, right, in these devices. But what the attackers have found is, you can go knock these things down, you can interrupt them, right? And you can kind of take over these devices relatively simply. And so some of the attacks I'll talk about, it's so far, because a lot of these things, you think about these PLCs, they're controlling things like flow and temperature and RPMs and mixtures and robotics and all of these things, right? Cyber physical system, which is what Gartner calls these devices, big time here, many of these, right? And so if I can get in and interrupt that, right, I could potentially do major damage, right? So the potential for a lot of damage on these is pretty high, but basically you just go, I'm going to interrupt, I'm going to intercept, I'm going to then modify, and then I can totally make my own injection on these things, right? So there's this very interesting on these, which leads to something like this one, right? This was called the S7 plus crash, not a sexy name, but it's talking about a very, very prominent and deployed PLC, which is the Siemens S7 device, right? So a couple things on this. So I think as an industry, we've kind of put our head in the sand that having these devices on an isolated network kind of protects us from exposure and threats, right? The only thing I'd have to say about that is, remember Stuxnet? That was a pretty isolated network. That didn't turn out too well for the end user who had those devices deployed, right? And so we need to rethink about this differently, right? If you look at Tenable, for example, so you think about guys like Tenable, Qualys, Rapid7, these are really good vulnerability scanners. This stuff is great stuff, don't get me wrong. But if you look at Tenable when it comes to OT stuff, there's skull and crossbones on the information on it. Basically don't, right? So we have to rethink how we talk to these devices, discover them, right? And secure them, right? So we need to kind of rethink that. Another interesting thing about these devices, like when I look at one of these devices, I can assess kind of its size, the OS, the firmware, and its state of security just by looking at the ports. So if I see a DB9 port on there, a serial port, I can look at it and say, okay, that thing's probably, it's got a connection of about 115 kilobits per second, right? It's got a firmware load of about 10 megabytes, okay? Pretty small. And I can look at that and say, okay, pretty small. So on that, you got way fewer lines of code, right? The other thing on these devices, with a lot of these XIoT devices, is the common libraries and the OEMing, right? It's not unlike any other thing in the supply chain, especially up in the cloud today when you look at APIs and this. All these common libraries, they go from device to device like luggage, right? And everyone's OEMing these. So you look at someone like Tyco, they've bought every single one of these, and then they come in, they bring them in, they put their name on it, all the libraries come in. It's all the common libraries. So you kind of look at the size, you say lines of code can determine the number of vulnerabilities on there, the amount of the libraries. But let's say I go look and I see a USB-C port on one of these things, okay? It's probably got 2 different OSs on it, virtual machines on the thing. It's very sophisticated, which means a lot of lines of code, tons of libraries, boatloads of vulnerabilities. That thing's way bigger target for someone to go after, right? So this one was kind of interesting because they definitely exploited these things, but it was Siemens' reply that was kind of interesting, right? And I often say, being here and focusing on this industry, and before I came to Phosphorus, I knew, I've just been around this industry too long, I knew this was the next horizon of the threat plane and security. This is why I'm at this company, right? But I often say it's kind of like being teleported back to the 90s, the early 90s, right? It's the state of XIoT security is basically like it was in the 90s, right? When we were just trying, it's like, Windows NT 3.5.1. I mean, it's just like old. And you think about, in the 90s when laptops and security, everything was proliferating, and think about it, like, the idea of getting visibility of all these devices everyone had was like, what? How do you do that? The idea of kind of rotating passwords. We couldn't even get anyone to use a password or articulate what the hell a password should be, let alone rotating credentials, firmware upgrades. It's like, please update your firmware. I mean, think about that, right? And that's what it's like here, right? So Siemens's, response to this was kind of interesting. And they sent a letter. And they basically said, here's what we want you to do. Update the firmware. Yeah, that's sure. Cool. I'll do that. Like, how many of these devices I have, I'll just send someone to each one and try to, hook in there. But just do it, update your firmware, it's no big deal. Enable access control. And these guys are like, access control? Most of these devices don't have access control. But enable that, then enable your password, and then set a password, right? And then, of course, do what we consider as hardening on the, disable all the unneeded ports and protocols, right? So makes sense, right? It's like, but to anyone who had these devices and received that, they were like, what the hell? Like, I can't do any of that, right? I don't even know how to do any of that. And this is kind of the trouble with these, right? They're all over the place. I don't even know half of what I have. I can't fully identify them. I have no way to really go do these things, but I know I need to, but it's very difficult. Trying to do it would be a purely manual effort, right? And if I'm a pharmaceutical company and I've got boatloads of these things, controlling all my mixtures and my robotics, and you say, yeah, just go update all that stuff in there, you're thinking, what? I mean, how do I even do that, right? It's kind of mind-boggling, but that one was classic, and we see that all over the place. Okay, so let's look at some research stats. Again, we've looked at hundreds. We've worked with hundreds of enterprises. Phosphorus, for example, was in stealth mode for 5 years before we even came out just this year with the product, which was already deployed in a lot of enterprises. So before we went out and became a company that you knew of and raised money, we actually had product market fit in a product that worked. It's pretty interesting because it's very, very hard to go figure out how to talk to these devices and actually remediate them, right? But what we see is 3 to 5 devices for every employee in the enterprise, right? So if you've got, if you're, and again, most of the time when we go and ask enterprises, how many of these devices do you think you have? Before we come in and start, working to, safely and gently scan and kind of discover these devices, how many do you think they have? And they'll say, well, it's probably about this much. And they're off almost all the time by, 40 to 60. It's kind of 50% is a no-brainer. They're off by, right? Because they just don't know. These things proliferate. They just don't know what they are, right? So you can just see kind of as the number of employees grow, 3 to 5 of these per employee. That's a lot. If you're a big company and you have a good number of employees, that's a lot of devices out there, right? Generally what we see is why this is so kind of mind-boggling. It makes up about 30% of your network and your attack surface, which is an awful lot, right? And imagine that's kind of growing. So that's a lot of devices, right? Okay, here's a poll. What percentage of XIoT devices operate with default passwords? What do you think? 99, 100. So I'll tell you why you're kind of right, but here's the deal. Okay, 50% right out of the chute are all deployed with default passwords of all XIoT devices I mentioned. But here's the thing. The other 50%, they were all changed to a different password at the time of deployment, right? And many times those default passwords are very easy to know what it was. In many cases, it's literally like the name of the product, and there's like simple things, right? And then they were never touched ever, ever, ever again, okay? So that other 50%, they're changed pretty much once and never touched again, right? So for all intent, right, it's pretty much 100% of these things, because that other 50%, I know it's probably one of 5, 6 different ones, and I got it, right? But 50%, so all these, think of today in the IT, if I went to you and said, hey, 50% of all your IT assets have default passwords, right? It'd be like, what? Like, no. How did that happen, right? But here, it's just been kind of accepted, right? And that's kind of the state of this. Okay, here's another one. What percentage of XIoT devices operate with end-of-life firmware? What do you think? 80%. 80%? Everyone's, it's high. Okay, it's actually 26% that we've seen so far. Still, think about it. The number of the devices, right, end of life, that high, but remember the other 74%, the average age of the firmware on that is 7 years. And in fact, the reason this company was built, Chris Ruland, who's my boss, the CEO, he was one of the originals of ISS. He founded X-Force, he did Endgame and Bastille. He read a study from the University of Wisconsin, right? And that study was focused on determining the half-life to N of firmware on an embedded smart device. And that showed 7 years. And he looked at that and said, oh, someone's got to fix that. I'm going to go fix that, right? And as we've gone out, we've proved that with everything we've looked at, right? So although it's supported, it's so old, it's just riddled with vulnerabilities that it's pretty bad, right? But full end of life, again, just think about a laptop that's had 7-year-old software, man, or your phone. It wouldn't even work, right? And that's how old some of this stuff is. That's kind of the percentage there. Now this one, here's all the CVSS stuff. Now, the only thing I have to say about this is, by any other measure in cybersecurity, this is an absolute epic failure, right? 50% of all these devices have a CVSS of 8 or above, right? 18% have critical CVEs of 9 of 10. And oftentimes they're shipped with those vulnerabilities, right? Think about all the libraries, just loaded with these things, right? So I've got 68% of all my devices with CVSs of 8 or above, right? Almost all of them are deployed with default credentials, right? They've got boatloads of ports and protocols, Bluetooth, wireless, SSH, Telnet, wide open, right? Firmware's at least 7 years old, has never been updated. No one's looking at them. No one's watching them. We can't find them, right? So you just kind of see the state of this. And so and think about it, 9 or 10, I can pop a shell on that thing. I don't even need much experience. I can be a absolutely novice hacker with hardly any experience. And I can go exploit that thing with a 9 or 10 critical vulnerability because I don't even have to think, I can just get into it, default password, and I can go and exploit that thing. It's one of the reasons these things are so highly targeted, right? Okay, let's talk about some of the biggest offenders so you can kind of see what some of these devices are. KVM switches, one of my favorites. So think about it. All your most critical assets are connected to one of your most critical assets, which is loaded with vulnerabilities. KVM switches, we see about 95% of them are deployed with default credentials, okay? About 95% of them. Look at the rare-10, so it's like, look at the ports on these things, right? So look at the rare-10, 64 ports, right? On that bad boy. Everything's connected to it. All your critical assets are connected to that thing. And they're all over the place, right? Again, most of them are running Ubuntu version 10. Last time anyone checked, there's a 2 in front of that number. They're totally unpatched. These things ship with vulnerabilities. It's just, this one is just astonishing, right? Just think of all the things that this thing is controlling and all the assets connected to it. And you just wonder why. Wow, wonder why someone would go try to compromise that thing. So those are one of our favorite ones, right? Lights out management, right? So you look at that port, and it's like, that looks like a USB port. That's a lights out management port. So you've got a little mini powerful computer inside a big computer that allows you to go access that thing when it's not bootable. And it allows you to do things to that computer that you definitely don't want a hacker to do, right? But you look at these things, they're all over the place. They're all running Linux, or like real-time operating systems like VxWorks, right? So they're just like these powerful little Linux computers inside a big one that I can go get to, right? Again, kind of wide open, and very exploitable, never thought about at all. And this is a big one we see all the time, is lights out management. Server cabinets and racks, right? So again, network devices. These things are very sophisticated, right? I mean, they come with multiple network connections. They've got power distribution, they've got cooling, cable management, tamper-resistant stuff. They've got all these things on it. They're just loaded with interfaces and ports and protocols. This guy, pretty much most anyone you'll ever find, default password, root Calvin, and I'm in, right? Again, I'm not telling you anything. You can't go look. Any of these guys can go look on Google and say, what is the default password of it? It's like, there it is. These ones are an issue. Now, one of the reasons this is really tough, even if you did want to deal with this, is that it's going to often require a power cycle to update them. And think about everything attached to it, right? So when you're going and, from a network perspective, and you think about power cycling that big thing, that's tough, right? It's not that they're thinking about it anyway, but even if they were, they'd be like, oh, hell no, I'm not powering that thing down. Look at all the stuff connected to it. But that is an issue, and these ones are big. We have one of these in our lab, and I mean, it's incredible how sophisticated and how many ports that thing has. Physical access controllers, right? And again, we talk about these in terms of they really suck. That's why we say it, they suck, because this security sucks. So these are amazing, and they're everywhere. Default password on one of these, Tyco on about 99% of them, right? Because Tyco owns like everything. All default, so I don't even care which one. It's like, it's Tyco, and even if it's a totally different model, all those default libraries, it's all the same, right? So we had a customer that was very big, you'd know their name, very big financial banking company on Wall Street. And they were so happy and proud. They built a brand new, beautiful, smart office. Amazing, right? Just beautiful, high tech, all thing. We came in and within one day we said, oh, by the way, we were able to unlock 6,400 of your doors, including the front door and the back door, including every one of your locations all around the place. And they were just like, what? How did you do that? Oh, it was really simple, actually. It started with Tyco, and then we could just go in and, we could just go in and like take control of it, right? Blew them away, right? They were like, how does that can't be possible. So you can just see kind of the physical, like you could, if you wanted to, like, thank God, not yet, but if you wanted to, I could like shut doors, lock doors, open doors, literally physical stuff, right? These ones are really bad because they're almost all critical vulnerabilities on these things. They ship with CVSs of 9 and 10 all over, right? It's really, really bad. I can just take absolute control of these things. And it really does not take a lot of skill to do it. And there's so many different one of these. And you can just think about it. Every company has these, right? I mean, it's big, small, whatever. So this one's a big one and definitely one we focus on. Printers, God almighty, printers. They're one of the biggest ones that suck. And think about a printer, right? They're just like promiscuous, right? I mean, you plug a printer in, it's like, I want to attach to everything. It's just like, oh my God, like I got Bluetooth, Wi-Fi, I've got everything. I'm at HTTP, HTTPS, Telnet, SSH, but they're just connecting to everything right out of the box. You don't even know. And if some IT guy goes and plugs in a printer, turns it on, puts in the paper, it works, I'm good, right? And you don't think about the fact that that thing is just like totally default connected to everything. And it's just wide open. And think about the kind of data that's getting pushed through that printer, like, right? So if I want to be somewhere and go hang out for a bit and do some exfil and, like, I want to hang out on a printer somewhere, right? And again, no one's looking at these things. And the one other thing that's, like when we first started looking at these, printers were a tough thing. That's why we kind of think of it in terms of the animal kingdom, kind of genus species, right, approach, right? Think about HP. They've been building printers for over 20 years, right? They've got tens of thousands of different types of printers, right? And you just say, holy moly, how would you even begin? I mean, like, do I have to go get 20,000 printers and get them in the lab and start hacking them? But what we found is if you look at HP, although HP has that many printers, over all of HP's existence, they have about 3 to 4 versions of firmware for all those printers. Isn't that amazing? And so basically what you have to do is go get one of those printers that has that type of firmware, and I just knocked out all those, and I get the other, I get the other, I get the other. If we can talk to one of those, we can talk to them all, right? And so that's kind of the way. You see Black Hat 2019, this was my old company, Checkpoint, that did that. And they discovered, 10,000 types of printer brands with critical vulnerabilities, right? And it's kind of overwhelming. It's like, oh my God, there's so many printer brands. And again, even printers, common libraries, OEM, it's very common across all of those, right? And the other thing about printers that's very interesting is just that they are one of the most targeted by nation states. Because think these things have 60 to 80 gig hard drives. It's not huge, but pretty decent, right? And they're powerful computers in many cases. There's a lot of options to go get into them, and I can sit on one of those things or many of them, and man, no one's going to know I'm there ever. And I can just ICMP and just pull stuff off very, very easy on printers. So printers definitely suck, right? VoIP phones, another big one. Classic kind of, network and enterprise IOT device. Now, a lot of these things are connected to a call managers, right? So you might have a lot of VoIP phones that are connected to a call manager. And so, you can just go exploit the manager. But these devices are all over the place. And again, they're almost all the same. They're shipping with loads of this stuff, common libraries all the way through them. But then you look at something like these new ones here, which are kind of the camera-equipped, kind of powerful kind of Linux devices. These ones are very powerful. They're like an iMac for a hacker. These things, right? It's like, oh my God, these things are very powerful. And so they're all over the place. These are the next kind of VoIP area that they're looking at because they're very, very powerful. They're literally like a powerful computer. Now, like we say, beacon of hope. We had a customer that had 31,000 of these, and we were so proud of them that we found only 700 had critical CVEs, right? That's phenomenal. The one interesting thing about that customer is when we went in and before we started discovering all the devices, they were so proud. They said, we have 26, we know exactly to the number. Like, we are very proud of this, 26,000 of these devices in our network. And they said, so we want you to go valid. We want you, so we're watching you. If you get, if you don't find that, you go find. And we ended up with 31,000. So we came back and said, well, the interesting thing is you had, 5,000 more of those you didn't even know about, right? And so that's, you thought you, which is awesome. You're better than most companies that you can even put a number on it, but you can already see how many of these devices they have and they didn't know, which is very, very common. They just don't know. These things proliferate like rabbits, right? Okay, what category is the biggest, worst offender? What device? What do you think? Cameras, yep. Absolute worst, by far, right? Most of these things are running something like BusyBox, or again, I look at a camera, I see a Linux server. There are so many of these things, right? We had a casino as a customer, who had like 80,000 cameras, right? So many of them. They're pre-shipped with malware. I've talked about it. They're very powerful. Thing about cameras to think about. So we moved from kind of the old cameras to HD cameras, right? Became more powerful. So you're thinking about how do we assess these cameras? What's the ports? How big, right? And then it moved to 4K. So a lot of these cameras are 4K. Think about how sophisticated those cameras are when you think about them as a Linux machine, right? Very sophisticated. The one thing over and over again about cameras, nobody can answer the question who manages those things. No one, right? It's like, you know, they do. They own it, right? Nobody knows. Is it IT? Is it IT security? Is it facilities? The facilities guy said, I put it in. I don't own the damn. I just plugged it in and got it running. I'm not the one that manages it. IT says, I don't do it, but security and facilities guy do. And security says, oh no, man, that's not a IT security thing. So nobody knows who manages them, and there's just so many. And I talked about some of the issues. This is by far the worst one that you want to do. And you just see it goes so beyond. I mean, just look at some of the areas these devices. When I showed that first slide saying there's 50 billion of these and it's growing, just look at the applications, right? Enterprise, OT, smart buildings and cities, cloud and connected devices, industrial, right? Internet, healthcare of things and healthcare environments, smart ships, which are basically just smart cities on a boat, right? Battlefield of things, so military applications, they're everywhere, right? So how do we mitigate it? Real quick, and I'm going to try to get through these. So let's talk about some of them, right? First of all, discovery, right? How do you discover these things? This is why it's so hard, right? You can't talk to these things like traditional computers. You can't. They don't work that way, right? These are very, very different. You can't just plug a scanner in and scan them. You can't just, put sniffers in these things. And a lot of times they've been approached with just, I'm gonna kind of VLAN it, or whatever. But the discovery is tough because you just can't use traditional scanners on these devices. They just don't talk to them. These things are in a different language. They're different ports, different protocols. They're all very different. And you can't just say, I'm going to scan these things because it doesn't work. And a lot of times they just roll over and they're not going to tell you what that is. So the difficulty is discovery. We need to have smarter discovery. We actually need to be able to talk to these devices in their native protocol, the way that they're intended and to be talked to. And that's very, very hard, because nothing really does that. But you've got to do that. You got to speak their languages. You got to talk to them safely and gently. Can't waterboard them, right? And that's what makes this hard. But that's what we need to do. If we can just talk to these things in their protocol, we can now identify them and tell you 100%. This is a printer, not an MRI machine, right? Or not only is it a printer, but it's an HP printer, model number this, with serial number this, with firmware that's here, with a password that's this, all of those things. Critical to know that if you're going to try to fix it, all right? You're not going to go out and try to fix something if you don't even know 100% what it is, right? So discovery's huge with this stuff, right? Then the next is firmware and hardening, right? So again, VLANs, a lot of times what organization will do is they just kind of VLAN these things off, right? Just the issue with that is the number of these devices and the flaming kind of issues with them, right? So it's kind of like, that room over there is on fire. I'm just going to shut that door, and there's a fire door, and I'm just going to shut it. I'm going to cover my eyes and ears and hope all is good. And you can't do that with these devices long term. You just can't. We need to be able to deal with them, address them, and actually work to be able to harden them and upgrade and downgrade the firmware. Why do I say downgrade the firmware? Well, let's say you've got an exploit on version 6 of your firmware, right? And there isn't a version 7, okay? And maybe you have that version 6 and the manufacturer of that says you'll get a patch in a year. Like, I don't know, I'm getting to it, right? So, what do? Well, what you want to be able to do is go downgrade the firmware to a lower version of firmware that doesn't have that exploit on it, right? It says log4j on version 6. I want to go down to version 5 or 4 and get the hell out of that thing, right? So we need to be able to upgrade and downgrade. We need to be able to harden the devices, right? So extraneous ports and protocols. Why do I need Bluetooth on all this? I don't need wireless. Telnet, no, shut that off. SSH, shut that stuff down. We can harden these devices and do a tremendous amount of security on them if we can just simply go and harden them, right? So these are all the things we need to be able to do, which again goes back to how critical it is to know exactly what the device is. Interesting thing about firmware is I also need to know, for example, if I am on version 6, maybe I'm on version 4 and the latest version is 8, right? Do I just go upgrade to 8? Or do I have to go 4 to 5 to 6 to 7 to 8? It's a very important question. You better know that, because if you just go from 4 to 8 and you can't do that, you'll kill that thing, right? So that kind of context and posture assessment, we need to know that. We need to know the path, how you do that, and you need to do that appropriately. That's one of the things. Then you have credentials and certificates. One of the things I'll say before you leave, you'd think with everything I presented to you that I'm standing here thinking, this is the number 1 or 2 or 3 issue that every CISO is thinking about. You got to go out and do your firmware and do all this stuff today. It's like, no, actually no. I wish it was, but it's not. It's not even maybe in the top 10 sometimes, right? But here's the thing. We need something like credentials. If you do anything else, we need to start updating credentials on these things, right? And so what I would say is what we should think about is if it's not on your top 5, top 6, right? It'll get there. I believe it'll get there. Just give it a quarter or two. But in the meantime, if I were to say you can actually do this very easily, it's not very expensive, it works, and you can go start rotating your credentials and take care of that issue. Oh, at the same time, maybe harden a little bit. Wouldn't you want to do that? It's like, yeah, that makes sense. If I could do that, given that's 30% of my network and my attack surface, yeah, I can do that. Do that, right? We can get to firmware, we can get to all this other stuff. Like, let's at least do credentials, right? And so that's the big thing. Now, PAM solutions don't talk XIOT. So what I'm showing here is all the technologies XIOT security solutions integrate with, right? So for us, we integrate with all of them, right? We go and update. We know exactly the type of password. Is it 12 characters? Does it take 40 characters, 60 characters? Does it not allow uppercase, lowercase, number, special characters? We know that, right? We update that, then push that back into the PAM and store the password there, right? So you can do this. You can do this. It's very actually pretty easy. And then, of course, we need to monitor these things. Why do we need to monitor them? I'll say one thing. We're far too dependent in this industry on MAC addresses and IP addresses, okay? And kind of thinking that MAC address is some kind of unspoofable, thing. If I tell you my name is John, which is my name, tell me everything about me. It's like, you can't tell me much at all if I tell you my name. That's like having your MAC address, right? IP address. So the thing about these devices, they move. Maintaining state on these things is critical, because one day they might have a MAC address, an IP address like this, and next day they have a totally different one, right? You can't use that, right? You need to maintain state. If I maintain state and tell you the state of this device yesterday, and I come back in a week or two, I should be able to tell you it's at the same state. And if not, I need to tell you, did I update this and now it's back to default, right? Does it have vulnerabilities? You got to maintain state, right? And lastly, you've got to be able to provide the reporting. It's hard to provide reporting when I don't even know all the other stuff, right? So that's kind of all of the things. And I think I'll finish with this slide. This is the way we need to think about this security, just like anything else, right? You need to be able to view this as XIOT attack surface management, just like you need to see your attack surface with all your other endpoints. You need to see it with this. You need to be able to see them, know them, do posture assessment, know exactly what it is, know what firmware's on it, know if it's default, see the vulnerabilities, everything. You need to do that. Second, you need to have hardening and remediation. We need to fix them, right? And one thing we see with every CISO we talk to is, if you come in and give me one more discovery thing that tells me how much, what I have and how shitty it is, and what a poor state of security is, and then tell me I can't fix it when I ask you, what do I do about it? I'm gonna run, right? So stop doing that. I'm tired of that. We need to actually fix it and remediate, and then we need to do formal detection and response on these things. Detect and response, to be able to monitor them, detect, respond, know when there's vulnerabilities. Paperclip attack, think about it. Almost all these devices, all I need to do is go put a paperclip in them, sets them back to default credentials. That's the easiest hack you could ever have, right? So we need to be able to detect and response to make sure we see these devices, we know their state, we follow them, we monitor them, and can actually respond when something happens, right? So here's what I covered. Hopefully it's helpful. Most companies do not know what they have, right? So they don't know even what to fix and how to fix it. I don't even know what I have, right? They don't have the ability to do it at scale. I have, if I have 50,000 cameras, seriously? Like, how do I do that at scale, right? They're not monitoring things, right? They're leaving all these devices at risk, and it's resulting in the kind of threats that I talked to you about today. So I hope this was interesting and helpful. Feel free to reach out to me and look at them. And I think on one of these slides, I just showed some of the solutions. This is us, but you can see some of these. Go check some of these guys out, right? There are solutions out there, and we're solving this problem. It's never been able to be solved before. It's very tough. It's really hard to do it, but we've done it. And the message is that you can actually go do this. And let's start at least with passwords. We can get the firmware, but let's start somewhere where you can do that. So hopefully that was helpful. And sorry if I went over. Thanks, everybody.